because the work is quite provocative. It's as you can see, without being, I think, necessarily confrontational or shocking or anything like that. The work still poses both bodies of work, although they work and address relatively familiar concerns, both formal and subjective. They do so in distinctive ways that Chris's approach, for one thing, takes advantage of newer materials, and thus is painterly but not about paint per se. Similarly, Joe's approach to the image and the object in such a way that where the image ends and the object begins is almost eradicated. There are plenty of artists addressing that problem of where a thing begins and the picture of the thing ends. Most importantly, although perhaps arbitrarily, because the two artists have been brought together as a result of the decision of the gallery, what is it that connects them? Because obviously they're they're addressing very, very different visual problems. I thought about it, and they're addressing it in some of the same ways. What we first notice about the work is texture. Then we notice gesture. Then finally, what we've been feeling all along emerges, and that's structure. So the work is in order of grasp: textural, gestural, structural. With Joe's work, also, one of the first things we notice is texture, except that we notice that equally with identity, with the identity of the object. You look at the piece done from the floral motifs. Those are taken from like the old warehouse ceilings, right?
They're actually from old sunflowers. They're molded.
They're molded from sunflowers themselves.
Yeah.
They look like the moldings from tin moldings from the ceilings of turn-of-the-century warehouses. And that chandelier hanging would seem to be an inversion of actual sunflowers. But so you see that those associations kind of swirl in on one another. The way the landscape seems to peek in and out of Chris's paintings, so that these artists are working on several levels at once, levels which make themselves apparent to you at various points in your study of the work. Once you notice one thing, one level, say the textural level, and that is superseded by, say, the conceptual level or the imagistic level or the gestural level. It's not that the sense of the texture goes away. It kind of fades behind and then recycles again. As you look, this work engages you, keeps you engaged, because it keeps its issues fresh.
I like the way when we talk about it in terms of how it keeps giving. I mean, I think that's part of the emphasis or the struggle, I guess, that goes on in trying to work the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it is a game about all those things, and I guess I talk about them in a different way, but it's what you're saying. It's the structure you say is maybe the space that I tried to create or I try to deal with.
Yes.
It's like I kind of always look at it as painting. The history of painting for me, or as this kind of work is ultimately about space, or comes down to space.
Mm-hmm.
Being whatever it is, pictorial or portraits or whatever, ultimately comes down to space. And the history of painting has always been the struggle with that, and it's been flat space, and there's been perspective space, and there's been all these kind of ways of looking at space. And for me, this is about sculpture and architecture and painting, because the material itself, the paint, acts not only as a pigment, as a color thing, but it also becomes a building material. And it becomes a building material that makes space.
I mean, you're like referring to a lot of my work as images, and it's kind of funny because I always think of myself as doing sculpture. And when somebody asks me, so what do you do? I always say, well, I make sculpture. And like these type of works, I always think of them as being more kind of sculptural, even though I am literally making images. Like I always think of sculpture as such a process-oriented endeavor, and whether the end product is two-dimensional, three-dimensional, to me is kind of irrelevant. And the idea of creating like rhythm and texture, is extremely, as a visual vehicle, is extremely important as something that is just engaging on both an intellectual and a visually kind of emotional level. Works for me to be able to get people sort of wrapped into the works in some way. So, and sometimes I end up thinking about my work as kind of a little emotionally cold at times, but I'd like to try to, kind of counter that with this process of kind of visual engagement. And also the idea of process to me is so important too. And so much of the work that I do is very much about repetition. Like for me, the idea of like repeating the same little motif thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Like I always think about, I always, describe making these kind of Scotch tape things as, say, like how like a major league pitcher works. Like day after day after day after day. It's the exact same motion over and over and over again. But eventually, like something sort of forms out of that, and that's how I get sort of engaged with these, because, the process to me is quite tedious. It's quite tedious, and I have to say it's boring after a while, because I'll do this for like 12 hours a day. I'm just literally like sitting at a table just applying Scotch tape. But at the same time, there's an excitement that when I'm working on something, it's that sort of literal blank slate. And then after a while, like you start seeing that kind of form begin to emerge until eventually the form starts telling you how to complete it. And that's that sort of engagement that I get with it, and that I hope, becomes, that I hope comes through with a viewer.
It's all paint, actually.
All paint.
It's all paint. Yeah.
But
The stuff that looks rubbery
is
actually, it's a water-based ink.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it looks like a fan melted.
I always try to stress when you tell people it's not anything but paint, because it always comes out that way.
That's fascinating. But then you recede back and create some of the same shapes with spray paint. Nothing could be flatter. So it's all about relative depth, relative relief.
Kind of go back to abstract expression. A lot of my work years and years ago was very much a de Kooning kind of thing like that, a process in that. And for a number of years, I worked through paintings like that. Always in my head, I had this idea of there was these three things, painting, architecture, and sculpture, that I'm trying to kind of get together in some way. And it took years and years of struggle to kind of get to where I think I am now, which is really starting to kind of get a grasp of that idea. But in the process, it's been a struggle with understanding the painting. You talk about, like, it looks like a fan pelt, things like that. Well, there's, and in the process of over years developing it, there were times when I backed it up with spackling paste, and I would put loose material and rags, and all the kind of traditional kind of ways people have built kind of backgrounds up, I think, in painting. And I got to a point where I started saying a number of years ago, I said, to do this right, you really have to get everything off the picture but paint.